My wife passed away suddenly, and now her estranged parents are blaming me and trying to take our home and kids. Last month, I lost my wife. Even as I sit here writing this, I can hardly wrap my head around it. It still feels like she's right here with me, like any moment now, she'll walk through the door or call my name. I keep hoping that maybe I'll wake up tomorrow and realize this has all been some awful nightmare. That day, I got a call, though not the kind I was expecting. It was a video call from my 7-year-old, something he'd never done in the middle of the day. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and I was still at work when I saw his name pop up on my phone. The call was coming from his iPad, and as soon as I answered, I could tell something was wrong. His little face was tight with worry. "What's going on, buddy?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. His answer hit me like a punch. "Something's wrong with Mommy." I told him to hand the phone to her, but instead, he walked toward the living room and flipped the camera around. That's when I saw her half-slumped on the couch, her head tilted to the side. My heart stopped. I called her name, my voice urgent, but she didn't respond. My son, sensing the panic in my voice, reached out and shook her, but instead of waking up, she slumped over even more. That's when my older son stepped in, trying to hold her head up. "Dad," he said, his voice filled with something I'd never heard before: fear. "She's not waking up, and she's really cold." Everything inside me went numb. Her skin looked too pale. Her body, unresponsive. I didn't waste another second. I shouted her name again as I bolted out of my office, already moving toward my car. We had a plan for emergencies, something I drilled into my boys. If anything serious ever happened, they were to run straight to our neighbors. Fighting against the rising panic, I told them to go next door, promising I'd call them right back. As soon as I hung up, I dialed 911, barely able to get the words out as I gave them our address and explained what was happening. The drive home was about 25 minutes, but it felt like I was trapped between two extremes, like time had slowed to a crawl, yet somehow the entire drive passed in a blink. I called my sons again and heard them knocking on the neighbor's door. Relief flooded through me when I heard our neighbors open up and my boys frantically explain the situation. Without hesitation, they all rushed back to the house to check on my wife. I stayed on the line, clinging to every update my son could give me. A few minutes later, he told me the police had arrived. I pushed the gas pedal harder, wishing I could make my car move faster. 15 minutes later, I finally pulled into the driveway. My boys were outside, speaking with the officers, while my neighbors stood nearby, their faces filled with worry. The sight of 2 ambulances and what felt like a whole fleet of police cars made my stomach twist into knots. I barely registered what my neighbors were saying as they walked up to me, trying to explain. Their voices blurred together, and all I could focus on was getting to my wife. I moved toward the paramedics, my heart hammering in my chest. "Is she okay?" My voice cracked, even as I asked. One of them shook his head. "I'm so sorry," he said gently. "She's been gone for a while, there was nothing we could do." The world around me disappeared. I could hear my own breathing, heavy and uneven, but everything else faded into the background. My legs felt weak as I dropped down beside her, cradling her head in my hands. She looked like she was just sleeping, like she'd wake up any second and tell me I was overreacting. I don't know how long I sat there. I don't remember what was happening around me. All I know is that the pain that hit me in that moment was beyond words, beyond anything I had ever felt before. But the worst part, the part that tore me apart, was knowing that my little boys were the ones who found her. They'd been playing outside, thinking she was just resting on the couch. It wasn't until they came back in, after more than an hour, that they realized something was wrong. The thought of them walking past her again and again, not knowing. I could barely breathe just thinking about it. The paramedics assured me that, based on what they'd seen, there were no signs of foul play. They asked about her health, and I told them about the severe headaches she'd been having lately, headaches we had brushed off as migraines. They said we'd have to wait for toxicology reports for answers, but at that moment, answers felt meaningless. My boys clung to me, their small bodies shaking. They were stronger than I was. I didn't know what to say, what to do. All I could do was hold them as we cried together. It didn't feel real. It still doesn't. It was like I had been ripped out of my life and thrown into someone else's nightmare. And the worst part was, I had no idea how to go on without her. But I had to. At some point, I had to pull myself together, because there was something I needed to do. I had to call my in-laws. I had to tell them what had happened to their daughter. The thought made my stomach tighten. My wife and her parents had been estranged for years. To understand why, you'd have to know a little about our backgrounds. I wasn't born in this country. My family moved here when I was 6, and life wasn't easy. My parents worked themselves to the bone to give me and my siblings a shot at something better. Education was always their priority, but money was tight. My dad used to dream about owning a house one day, but we never managed to save enough rent, and good school districts drained whatever little we had. He passed away when I was 17, and my mom lost her battle with cancer just 3 years ago. They never got to see that dream come true. My wife, on the other hand, grew up in a completely different world. She had everything: private schools, designer clothes, multiple vacations every year, always flying first class. Her parents paid for her education in full, while I scraped my way through college with scholarships, student loans, and a series of part-time jobs that stretched out my graduation timeline. But don't get me wrong, she was one of the hardest working people I'd ever met. Her success wasn't handed to her. The only thing her parents gave her was a financial safety net; everything else, she earned. We met 6 years ago at work, both fresh out of college and starting in the same position. From the moment we met, something just clicked. It didn't take long before we were inseparable. Even after we both stayed at the company, I moved up the ranks a little faster. Eventually, I was making more than double her salary, which let me focus on wiping out my student loans as quickly as possible. And now, somehow, I was supposed to call the parents she barely spoke to and tell them she was gone. Once my student loans were paid off, I set my sights on the next goal: saving for a house. It wasn't just about having a home of my own, it was about fulfilling my parents' dream, the one they never got to see come true. I worked tirelessly, putting every extra dollar aside, all while making sure we were financially secure enough to start a family. When I finally felt ready, I proposed to my wife. She was overjoyed. She said yes without hesitation, and for the rest of that night, we couldn't stop smiling. The following weekend, we decided to share the good news with her parents. We knew their approval wasn't necessary, but we still wanted to include them in our happiness. To our surprise, they seemed genuinely pleased, at least at first. Then, out of nowhere, they made an announcement: as a wedding gift, they were going to give us a house. My wife was ecstatic. And I'll admit, the idea of starting our marriage in a home of our own was exciting. But something in me hesitated. I wanted to know the details before celebrating. That's when they dropped the conditions. The house, they said, would be in my wife's name only. And before the wedding, they expected us to sign a prenup that would protect any and only pre-marriage assets, just in case, as they put it, I was marrying her for money. Their words stung. I had never given them any reason to doubt my intentions, yet here they were, openly questioning them. The assumption that I was after their wealth was not only insulting, but it also didn't even make sense. I earned more than my wife. Our financial arrangement had always been fair. She made around $100,000 a year, while I earned about $240,000. We split expenses based on our incomes, with me covering 2/3 and her contributing 1/3. Even after marriage, this would continue, and if she ever got pregnant, I was fully prepared to take on all financial responsibilities so she wouldn't have to worry about anything. I calmly explained this to them, hoping to put their concerns to rest. But it didn't matter. They had already made up their minds about me. The truth is, my in-laws had never liked me. Not from the moment we met. And to this day, I still don't know why. I had always treated them with nothing but respect, yet they barely spoke to me. They never showed any real interest in getting to know me, and my mother-in-law even made a backhanded remark once, saying her daughter could have done better in the looks department. Maybe she was right, but what I lacked in looks, I made up for by being a devoted and loving husband. I did everything I could to bridge the gap between us, but no matter what I did, they never warmed up to me. My wife noticed it too. She confronted them about it multiple times, but nothing ever changed. At one point, they even tried to convince her to leave me, to keep looking for someone better. But she never cared what they thought. She loved me, and that was enough. So when they brought up the prenup, she was furious. She protested immediately, hurt by their lack of trust. But they wouldn't budge. They kept bringing up my background, subtly and not so subtly, reminding her of where I came from, as if that was some kind of red flag. They urged her to be cautious, acting as if I had something to gain from the marriage beyond the woman I loved. The argument escalated quickly. My wife, fed up with their conditions and insults, made a decision right then and there. She told them we didn't want their house. We would buy one ourselves, on our own terms. I stood by her without hesitation. That was the final straw for my in-laws. Their disappointment turned into anger, and suddenly, I was the villain, the one driving a wedge between them and their daughter. They accused me of manipulating her, of causing unnecessary drama. Their voices rose, their words grew harsher, and before we knew it, the discussion had turned into an all-out shouting match. Finally, we had enough. We walked out and never looked back. That was the last time we spoke to them. My wife decided that day that she was done with them, and from then on, they were no longer a part of our lives. Years passed without a single word exchanged. In that time, we bought a house together. We built a life. We had 2 beautiful sons. And now, she was gone. And I had to be the one to call them and tell them. I didn't expect sympathy from my mother-in-law. I knew better than that. But even so, I wasn't prepared for her reaction. As soon as she processed what I was saying, she started screaming at me. Through the phone, her voice was raw with fury. "This is your fault," she shrieked. "You killed her. You're going to pay for this." I stood there in stunned silence. I had never expected her to comfort me, but I also hadn't expected this level of hate. I tried calling my father-in-law, but he didn't answer. I figured she would tell him. The next day, they showed up at my house. Uninvited. They were already yelling before I even opened the door. "You killed our daughter," my mother-in-law wailed. "We will never forgive you." My boys, who had never even met their grandparents, stood frozen behind me, wide-eyed and terrified. I raised my hands, trying to calm them down, but my father-in-law cut me off. "You didn't deserve her. You should have just left her alone." His voice was full of disgust, like I had been nothing more than a stain on their daughter's life. My wife's mother kept screaming, her accusations growing louder and more hysterical. But the worst part, the part that made my stomach turn, was that they never once stopped to look at my sons. They didn't see the fear in their eyes, the way their small bodies trembled at the sight of these strangers screaming at their father. That was it. I had no choice. I called the police. When the officers arrived, my in-laws wasted no time accusing me of murder. The officers exchanged a glance before turning to me. I took a deep breath and calmly explained everything, how my sons had found her, how we had immediately called 911. The officers questioned my boys briefly, and they answered honestly. Then they turned back to my in-laws and explained that there was nothing they could do. If they wanted answers, they would have to wait for the toxicology and autopsy results. Before they left, the officers asked if I wanted to press charges. I didn't. I just wanted them gone. I wanted to grieve in peace, alone with my boys. A few days later, I got a call from the doctor. The first autopsy results were in. My wife had died from a brain clot, a sudden, fatal blockage that had cut off blood flow to her brain. She had no chance of survival. There was nothing anyone could have done. Holding that report in my hands, I let out a breath I hadn't even realized I was holding. I called my in-laws again. I told them the results. They listened. They didn't scream this time. They didn't accuse me of anything. For the first time since all of this began, they were quiet. And for a brief moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, they would finally let go of their hate. The next battle with my in-laws was over the funeral. My wife and I had never really talked about death, not in detail, at least. We were young, and planning for something so distant didn't seem necessary. But I do remember one conversation. It was last year, after attending a funeral together. She had mentioned, almost in passing, that she would prefer something simple, something outdoors. She had said indoor funerals felt too formal, too cold. She wanted to be surrounded by nature. So when the time came, I wanted to honor that. I suggested holding the service in our backyard, a place she had poured her heart into. The flowers she had planted, the trees she had nurtured, they were pieces of her, living on. It felt right to say goodbye in a space that had meant so much to her. Peaceful, thoughtful. But my in-laws were completely against it. They insisted on a traditional church service, citing the importance of religious customs and the comfort they found in them. I understood their perspective, but I knew my wife. She hadn't been deeply religious. This wasn't about them, it was about her. I refused to budge. That was the final trigger. My mother-in-law was livid. She accused me of overstepping, of taking control of something that wasn't mine to decide. My father-in-law didn't hold back either, hurling accusations that cut deeper than I could have ever expected. "You never really loved her," he spat. "You probably killed her for the life insurance." I stared at him, stunned. How could he even think that? Through clenched teeth, I told them the truth. My wife and I had been happy. Our marriage was strong, our home filled with love. There had been no hidden tensions, no unspoken resentments. What had happened to her was tragic, yes, but it had nothing to do with our marriage. Nothing. Still, they didn't believe me. I stood my ground. The ceremony would be held outside, just as my wife had wanted. But they didn't stop there. Over the next few days, they fought me on every little detail, choosing the music, the guest list, even the coffin. They didn't want certain people there, old friends they had cut ties with long ago. But this wasn't about their grudges. It was about my wife, and I knew she would have wanted those people to say goodbye. So I shut them down. If someone loved her enough to come, they have the right to be here, I told them. I'm not banning anyone. I could see the resentment in their eyes, but there was nothing they could do. Then, the day arrived. The day I had been dreading. A part of me just wanted it to be over. Another part wasn't sure I could get through it. But my boys gave me strength. People showed up, so many more than I had expected. It was overwhelming to see just how loved she had been. Friends, coworkers, neighbors, everyone whose life she had touched in some way. Some of my closest friends stepped up, quietly taking care of things around the house, offering to help in any way they could. I should have been grateful. And I was. But watching them clean my home, seeing them take over tasks I couldn't bring myself to do, it only made me feel more helpless. More broken. Everything reminded me of her. A phrase someone said. A song that played. A flower in the garden. It all hit me like a wave, one after another, until I found myself asking my friends over and over again if this was real. If this was actually happening. But the pain in my chest was real. So, yes. This was real. After the funeral, I collapsed into bed. Our bed. The one where my boys had been sleeping beside me every night since. I was surrounded by her clothes, her jewelry, her phone still vibrating with messages she would never read. I broke down. A few days later, I had to face something else I wasn't ready for. The reading of her will. We sat in the lawyer's office, my in-laws stiff and silent beside me. My stomach twisted as the lawyer started going through the document, explaining what my wife had left behind. It was simple. Everything she had, she left to me and the boys. That was the moment my in-laws snapped. They lost it. You killed her for the money, my mother-in-law screamed, her voice sharp with rage. You're nothing but a gold digger. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I had already lost my wife. Now they wanted to paint me as a monster, a man who had somehow orchestrated all of this for financial gain. The accusations were absurd, but that didn't stop them from throwing them at me. They actually believed that if she had never married me, she would still be alive. I knew they were grieving. I knew their pain was twisting their thoughts into something irrational. And so, I tried to stay calm. I bit my tongue, let them vent, let them lash out. But there was a limit to what I could take. I finally looked them in the eye and told them the truth. I didn't need her money. I never did. She left it to me because she loved me, and she loved our boys. If you have a problem with that, fine. But I won't sit here and listen to you blame me for something I had no control over. I told them they could reach out when they were ready to have a civil conversation. If that day ever came. But they weren't done. Their next target was the house. They started prying, demanding to know what would happen to it. Who would get it? I stared at them blankly before answering. My wife and I bought it together. So it stays with me and the boys. That answer didn't sit well with them. You can't afford it, they insisted. You should sign it over to us. I almost laughed at the audacity. I'm not signing anything over to you, I said firmly. That was when the threats started. If you don't, we'll take your kids away from you. I went still. Slowly, I met their eyes. My voice was steady, calm, but firm. This is ridiculous, I said. I am not giving you our home. And you are not taking my children. They could threaten all they wanted. I wasn't going anywhere. And neither were my boys. Their faces tightened with anger, their frustration practically radiating off them. My refusal to comply only seemed to fuel their rage further. They exchanged heated glares, their voices growing sharper as they refused to back down. It was clear that they weren't going to let this go. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I won't continue this conversation under these circumstances, I said, keeping my voice as calm as possible. We need time apart to cool off. You both need to really think about what you're asking of me. But let me be absolutely clear, I am not giving you my house. No matter what. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked away. There was no reasoning with them in that moment, and I hoped that some distance would allow for a more rational discussion down the line. But I underestimated just how far they were willing to go. A week ago, I received a letter from my late wife's estranged parents. A formal demand. They wanted me to sign over the house to them or face legal action. Their reasoning? As the children's grandparents, they believed they had the right to raise them in the home their daughter had loved. I was stunned. It felt like the ground had been ripped from under me. I had already lost my wife, now I was facing the possibility of losing my own children, my own home. The weight of their threats settled over me like a crushing force. I immediately sought legal counsel. My lawyer reassured me that their claims had no legal standing. They had no rights to my children, no basis for taking my home. But even with that reassurance, the emotional toll was unbearable. The thought of a prolonged legal battle, of dragging my boys through even more turmoil, was exhausting. I found myself questioning everything. Had I done something to provoke this? Had I mishandled things with my in-laws to the point that they felt justified in taking such an extreme step? I didn't know. I only knew that I was desperate for advice, for support, for anything that could help me navigate this impossible situation. Update 1. I can't express how grateful I am for the support and advice I received after my initial post. The kindness of strangers, the shared experiences, the encouragement, it all meant more than I can say. Since my wife's passing, every day has been a battle, and this situation with my in-laws has only added to the weight on my shoulders. I wanted to provide a quick update on where things stand. Following my lawyer's advice, I have not engaged in direct communication with my in-laws. Instead, I've focused all my energy on maintaining a sense of normalcy for my children. They are my priority. Their world has already been shaken. I refuse to let this situation take any more from them. Meanwhile, my lawyer drafted a response to their legal threats, firmly outlining why their demands held no legal weight. The letter was sent, and now we wait for their reply. It's an incredibly stressful time, but I'm doing my best to stay strong, for my boys, for myself. Update 2. It's been 4 months since my last update, and I finally have some resolution to share. I couldn't speak much about it while legal proceedings were ongoing, but now that everything has concluded, I can finally breathe again. After my lawyer's response, my in-laws didn't back down. They decided to take legal action. What followed was a grueling court battle over the custody of my children and the ownership of my home. Their case was built entirely on emotion, pleas about wanting to raise the boys in their daughter's home, arguments that they could provide them with a better upbringing. But when it came to actual legal standing, they had nothing. My lawyer was prepared, armed with proof of joint ownership of the house, evidence of the stable and loving environment I provided for my children, and clear documentation that my in-laws had never been an active part of their lives. The judge saw right through their arguments. When the final ruling came, I could hardly believe it. The judge confirmed what we already knew: the house was legally mine. More importantly, he reprimanded my in-laws for trying to take my sons away from me during such a vulnerable time. Their case was dismissed. The relief was overwhelming. But even with this victory, it didn't erase the grief. I still wake up every day missing my wife. I still hear her laughter in the house, see glimpses of her in my sons' faces. The pain hasn't faded, and neither has theirs. Every night, when I tuck them into bed, they ask about her. They wonder why she had to go, why things couldn't be different. And I struggle to find the right words to comfort them when I still don't have the answers myself. Thankfully, my friends have been an incredible support system. They've stepped in where they can, helping me with day-to-day responsibilities, making sure the boys and I aren't alone in our grief. Having them around has made this unbearable time just a little bit more bearable. Update 3. Life has finally begun to settle. My boys and I have found a rhythm, establishing new routines and leaning on each other as we navigate this chapter of our lives. I've made it my mission to provide them with as much love and stability as possible. From school activities to weekend outings, I'm doing everything I can to make sure they know they're safe, that they're loved. The biggest relief? My in-laws have not made any further attempts to interfere. It seems the court's ruling has finally put an end to their fight. I haven't heard from them, and if they ever do show up on my doorstep, I'm fully prepared to call the police if necessary. The boys are adjusting as best they can. I've sought professional support to help them process their grief, and while the pain of losing their mother will never fully go away, they're learning to live with it. We all are. As for me, I'm still finding my way. There's no manual for how to move forward after losing the love of your life. The void she left is something I feel every single day. But I'm learning. Learning how to be both mother and father. Learning how to keep her memory alive for our boys. Learning how to heal. This journey isn't over. But for the first time in a long time, I feel like I can breathe again. Thank you all for being a part of this journey. Your words of encouragement have meant more than I can ever express. I'll keep moving forward, one day at a time.